close your eyes and let's travel back to a time when medicine was less about healing and more about hope, or perhaps hopelessness, when doctors carried blades instead of stethoscopes, when the cure for a headache was a hole in the skull, and the remedy for melancholy was a pint of missing blood. This is not a lesson, not a warning, just a whisper of history, the kind that fades as you listen, the kind that lulls rather than shocks, because tonight we are not here to learn, but to sleep, to let the weight of centuries press gently on your eyelids as we wander through the forgotten halls of medical madness, where leeches clung to skin like living bandages, where barbers doubled as surgeons, where George Washington, yes, the first president, was drained of his blood, drop by drop, until there was none left, and they called it medicine. Imagine, if you can, a world where pharmacies sold mummies, not as curiosities, but as cures, ground into powder, stirred into wine, swallowed for strength, where kings, like Charles II, sipped royal death drops, a syrup of human skull, and no one questioned it, where radiation, bright and burning, was bottled as tonic, where women smoothed their skin with radium creams, where men brushed their teeth with uranium paste, and no one yet knew the cost. Picture the desperation, the slow, slow acceptance of tobacco smoke blown into drowning victims, not through their mouths, but through their most private openings, because the Royal Humane Society swore it worked, or the quiet horror of a child forced to swallow a live frog, because the old wives said it would stop their cough, or the mothers who rubbed snail slime on throats, who fed their babies opium for teething, who trusted mercury to cure syphilis, even as it rotted teeth, loosened bones, hollowed minds. This was medicine once, not so long ago. And if it feels like a nightmare, well, that's because it was. But we are not here to fear, only to drift, to let these thoughts dissolve like sugar in water. Because soon, very soon, we will leave the doctors behind and step into the darker halls, the places where justice was not blind, but grinning, where punishment was not about order, but pain, slow, slow pain, the kind that took days, the kind that turned screams into musics, like the brazen bull, a hollow beast of bronze, where victims roasted alive, where their cries became low, mournful notes, like a flute, or so the stories say, or scaphism, the boats, a punishment so slow even the torturers grew bored, where a prisoner, trapped between wooden planks, was force-fed milk and honey, then left for the sun, the flies, the creeping things, until the air itself grew thick, until the body, still breathing, was no longer a body at all, or the rack, the simple, terrible rack, that stretched a man longer than nature intended, until tendons snapped, until joints popped, until the spine itself gave up, or rat torture, where a cage was strapped to flesh, where heat was applied, where small, frantic claws dug deeper, seeking escape, or the pair of anguish, a device that needs no description, yet we will describe it anyway, in slow, unfeeling words, because that is what we do here. We speak without urgency, we explain without care, until even the worst horrors feel like nothing at all, like ducking stools, where women accused of witchcraft were plunged into water, again and again, to prove their innocence, because sinking meant purity, floating meant guilt, and death, either way, was inevitable, or flaying, skin peeled back like fruit rind, muscles exposed to air, a punishment so ancient even the gods winced, or the Judas cradle, where the weight of one's own body did the work, where gravity was the executioner, or the lead sprinkler, a Chinese punishment, where molten metal poured down the throat, filling the stomach, solidifying, cooling, becoming a tomb, inside out. These were the ways of the world once, not so different from the medicine, just another kind of madness, another kind of trust in pain. But we are not here to judge, only to sleep, to let these thoughts blur at the edges, to let them fade into the hum of the night, because the past is over, and the present is soft and quiet, and you are safe, and these stories, these long, winding, tedious stories, are just that, stories, meant to bore you, to drain your thoughts like blood from a vein, until there is nothing left but silence and sleep, deep, deep sleep, where no leeches wait, no torturers linger, just rest, endless rest. So good night, sleep well, and remember, no matter how strange your dreams, and they will never be as strange as history, never as cruel, never as pointless, and for that, at least, we can be grateful. So close your eyes, let go, and drift away, away. Bizarre medical treatments, imagine, if you can, a world where sickness was not fought with pills, but with holes, where health was measured not in strength, but in blood lost, where doctors, if they could be called doctors, carried lancets instead of medicines, and their cure for nearly everything, from fever to fatigue, was simply to drain the body dry, drop by crimson drop. This was bloodletting, an idea so old it predates history itself, practiced by the ancient Egyptians, who believed the body's humors needed balance, a belief that lasted and lasted through Greek temples, Roman baths, medieval monasteries, all the way to the gleaming halls of Victorian science, where physicians still reached for their blades, still sliced veins open, still watched their patients grow pale, and called it healing. One of the most famous victims, if victims is the right word, was George Washington, the first president, the father of a nation, who in his final hours was bled not once, not twice, but 4 times, 4 times, as doctors took pint after pint, until his body had nothing left to give. And still they took more, believing, truly believing, this would save him. It did not, it could not, and so he faded, as so many did, into the quiet, into the dark. But bloodletting was not always about blades. Sometimes nature provided its own tools, in the form of leeches, small, slimy, hungry creatures, that clung to skin with silent determination, their bites painless, their appetite endless. They were farmed, yes, farmed, by the thousands, kept in jars, in dark rooms, in the basements of apothecaries, where they waited, patient, patient, for their turn to feed. Leech farming was an industry once, a careful science where the best specimens, the most voracious, were prized, were cultivated, were sold for fortunes, because a good leech, a proper leech, could drain a man without him even noticing, could attach itself to the exact right vein, could suck until it swelled, until it grew fat, until it finally, lazily, let go. And the doctor, if he was watching, would nod, would declare the treatment a success, would ignore the dizziness, the weakness, the slow creeping pallor of his patient, because the leech had done its job, The bad blood was gone, or so they thought for centuries, centuries. This was medicine. This was normal. This was accepted. The rich, the poor, the young, the old, all subjected to the same quiet draining, the same slow loss, the same blind faith in an idea that never worked, never could work. But no one questioned it, no one dared, because what else was there? The leeches, at least, were gentle, were predictable, were easier to trust than the surgeons with their crude knives, their messy incisions, their hurried hands. Leeches were clean, were natural, were almost kind, in their way. They did not scream, did not beg, did not protest. They simply fed and fed and fed, until the doctors declared them finished, until the patient, lighter now, emptier now, was sent home, told to rest, told to recover, as if the absence of blood was somehow a cure, as if the body did not need every drop, as if weakness was strength, as if pale skin was a sign of health. This was the world once, not so long ago, a world where barbers, yes, barbers, kept leeches in their shops, where a haircut might end with a creature on your neck, where medicine and grooming were the same trade, were the same hands that shaved beards, also opened veins. It sounds like madness now, like a bad dream, but it was real. It was ordinary. It was daily life, for hundreds, thousands of years. And though we know better now, though we laugh at the idea, though we shudder at the thought, there was a time, a long, long time, when bloodletting was the answer, when leeches were the cure, when sickness was fought not with knowledge, but with loss, with faith, with the slow, slow drip of blood into a bowl, and the quieter drip, drip, drip of time passing, of centuries turning, of ideas fading, until at last, at long last, the leeches were put away, the lancets were set down, and the world finally woke up. But that is a story for another night. For now, just sleep, just rest, just let the weight of this old, old madness press you down into the pillows, into the dark, where no leeches wait, no blades gleam, just silence, just peace, just dreams untouched by history's strange, strange hands. Imagine, if you can, a time long before hospitals, before anesthesia, before even the simplest understanding of how the brain truly works, when a throbbing headache, a dizzy spell, or strange behavior might be cured with nothing more than a sharp stone and a strong arm. This was trepanation, the ancient practice of drilling, scraping, or cutting holes into the human skull, a practice so old that we've found skulls from the Stone Age. Yes, the Stone Age, with carefully made holes still visible in the bone, holes that had healed over, meaning these people, these early patients, somehow survived this brutal procedure and came back for more. The reasons were many, or perhaps few: headaches, seizures, mental illness, or even just to let out evil spirits, thought to be trapped inside the skull. The methods varied from careful scraping with obsidian blades to rough drilling with primitive tools. Some cultures used twisted cords to slowly wear through the bone. Others preferred sharpened shells or metal spikes. The sound must have been terrible, the crunch of bone giving way, the patient awake, or maybe drugged with herbs, or alcohol, or nothing at all, just held down by strong hands, while someone, perhaps a priest, perhaps a healer, perhaps just the village elder with steady fingers, worked their way through skin, muscle, and finally bone. The manuals from medieval times, what few survive, describe it in dry, unfeeling terms, as if carving into a living skull was no different than whittling wood. They spoke of the patient becoming quiet during the operation, a phrase that could mean anything from peaceful acceptance to unconsciousness from pain. The tools grew slightly more refined over time, but the basic idea remained the same: a hole, a release, a hope that whatever plagued the mind would escape through this new opening. And yet, somehow, it worked often enough that people kept doing it, kept trying it, kept passing the knowledge down through generations, because sometimes against all logic, the patient lived, sometimes the headache did go away, sometimes the seizures lessened, and so the practice continued, not just in Europe, but in places as far apart as Peru, where ancient surgeons used ceremonial knives, to Africa, where the holes were made in intricate patterns, to the islands of the Pacific, where the sound of scraping bone was just another part of village life. The theories changed over time, from releasing demons to balancing pressures to simply clearing the mind. But the act itself stayed eerily similar. A circle cut into the living skull, a piece of bone removed, the brain beneath exposed, if only for a moment, to the open air. The risks were enormous: infection, brain damage, death, and yet the fact that we've found so many healed skulls means that more people survived than we might think. More people walked away from this crude surgery and lived to tell about it, or at least lived. The practice never truly died out. Even today, there are those who swear by trepanation, who claim that a hole in the skull can increase blood flow to the brain, can expand consciousness, can cure modern ailments just as it once cured ancient ones. They are few, these modern trepanation believers, but they exist, carrying on a tradition that stretches back to the very dawn of human medicine, a tradition of desperation, of hope, of stone against bone, of pain in exchange for relief. And as strange as it seems, as brutal as it looks, it was, in its own way, a kind of healing, a kind of science, a kind of faith that the body could be opened and somehow made better. So sleep now, and be glad your headaches are treated with pills, not holes, with rest, not drills, with silence, not the sound of your own skull being slowly, carefully, terrifyingly opened to the world. Imagine, if you will, a time when the line between medicine and magic was so thin as to be nearly invisible, when the cure for what ailed you might come not from a garden or a chemist's shop, but from a tomb. This was the age of corpse medicine, when the dead were not simply buried, but harvested, ground into powder, stirred into wine, and swallowed in the name of health. The practice began, as so many strange things do, in ancient times, with the belief that something powerful lingered in the bodies of the dead, particularly those preserved through time. The Egyptians, masters of mummification, never intended their carefully prepared dead to become remedies. But once the world discovered these preserved bodies, these perfect, dry, ancient humans, it was only a matter of time before someone thought to grind them up and eat them. By the Middle Ages, mummy powder had become one of the most sought-after medicines in Europe. Apothecaries stocked it alongside herbs and spices. Physicians prescribed it for everything from headaches to plague. The rich carried it in ornate boxes. The poor saved for years to afford just a pinch. The logic, if it could be called logic, was that the embalming process had imbued the flesh with mystical properties, that the spices used in preservation, the myrrh, the bitumen, the natron, had transformed simple flesh into something more, something healing, something magical. The trade in mummies became so vast that soon real Egyptian mummies were not enough. Enterprising merchants began faking them, using the bodies of executed criminals, beggars, even recently deceased patients, drying them in the sun, coating them in pitch, and selling them as the real thing. No one seemed to care or notice, as long as the powder was dark and smelled ancient. It would do. The height of this bizarre practice came in the 17th century, when kings and queens, the very people who should have known better, became its most ardent supporters. King Charles II of England, a man of science in many ways, kept a personal recipe for what he called royal death drops, a tincture made from powdered human skull, dissolved in alcohol, and taken for, of all things, epilepsy. He brewed it himself, in his private laboratory, and swore by its effects, though history does not record whether it actually worked, or simply made him too drunk to notice his seizures. The skulls used for this purpose were not just any skulls. They came preferably from young men who had died violently, the theory being that their life force, cut short, remained potent in their bones. Executions thus became not just matters of justice, but of pharmacy, as crowds gathered to watch men hang. Apothecaries waited below, ready to collect the still warm bodies for processing. The Irish, for a time, were considered particularly good sources of medicinal skulls, their bones supposedly stronger, their essence more vital, thanks to their diet of milk and potatoes. Meanwhile, in Germany, physicians developed a taste for usnea, the moss that grew on skulls left exposed to the elements, scraped off and mixed into potions, while in Denmark thieves robbed graves not for jewelry, but for the fat of the dead, rendered into man oil and used to treat wounds. The poor, as always, suffered most from this trade, their bodies stolen from paupers' graves, their bones ground up without ceremony, while the rich, if they wished to partake in corpse medicine, could at least ensure their own relatives were not part of the supply. The Church, strangely enough, often facilitated this trade, selling bits of saints, real or imagined, as cures, a finger bone here, a tooth there, all guaranteed to heal, if the price was right. By the 18th century, the practice had begun to fade, as science advanced, and the idea of eating the dead became, finally, distasteful to the upper classes. But it never fully disappeared. Traces lingered in folk remedies, in whispered cures passed down through generations, and even today, in some places, the old beliefs hold that there is power in bone, in flesh, in the remnants of those who came before. So sleep now, and be glad your medicine comes in clean, white pills, and not in powder, scraped from some long-dead pharaoh's toe. Rest easy, knowing that if you wake with a headache, no one will suggest you drink from a king's crushed skull, and dream, if you dare, of a time when death was not an end, but an ingredient. Imagine a time when glowing in the dark was considered healthy, when radiation wasn't feared but celebrated, when pharmacies sold jars of pure radium, as if they were vitamin supplements. This was the golden age of radioactive quackery, a brief but bizarre period in medical history when science's newest discovery became everyone's favorite cure-all. It began in the early 1900s, just after Marie Curie isolated radium, when the world became intoxicated by the soft blue glow of radioactive materials. Doctors marveled at how radiation made their skin tingle, how it made their hands feel warm, and immediately assumed these sensations must be beneficial. Soon, every ailment from arthritis to impotence had a radioactive solution. The most famous product was Radithor, a popular tonic made by dissolving radium in water, advertised as a cure for the living dead. Wealthy socialites drank it daily, paying enormous sums for tiny bottles of glowing water, unaware they were literally drinking themselves to death. Then came radium cosmetics, face creams laced with thorium that promised eternal youth, radium soaps that energized the skin, even radium condoms guaranteed to produce vigorous offspring. The beauty industry embraced radiation with particular enthusiasm. Salons offered X-ray hair removal treatments where women would sit for hours while radioactive beams burned away their unwanted hair, along with layers of skin, leaving some permanently scarred but temporarily hairless. Dentists got in on the craze too, selling radium toothpaste that made teeth glow in the dark. The treatment became so popular that special tobacco resuscitators were installed along the Thames, sturdy boxes containing all the necessary equipment, ready at a moment's notice to administer smoke where the sun doesn't shine. Doctors theorized the treatment worked because tobacco was a stimulant, because the warmth of the smoke counteracted the cold of the water, because the nicotine made the heart beat faster. They were half right about that last part. Nicotine does stimulate the heart, but whether blowing it up someone's bottom was the best delivery method, history has since decided otherwise. The treatment wasn't limited to drowning victims. Physicians soon began prescribing tobacco smoke enemas for everything from headaches to hernias, from cholera to colds. Special enema kits became status symbols among the wealthy, with ornate pipes and gold-trimmed bellows. Some doctors even claimed tobacco enemas could revive victims of hanging, if administered quickly enough. The practice spread beyond England to Europe and America, where it was used to treat typhoid fever, and even attempted, unsuccessfully, on George Washington during his final illness. Meanwhile, back at the Royal Humane Society, they were adding new techniques to their resuscitation methods, like hanging victims upside down to drain water from their lungs, or rolling them over barrels to press the water out, all while continuing their beloved smoke enemas. The treatment's popularity began to wane in the early 1800s, as doctors noticed some unfortunate side effects, like patients vomiting uncontrollably after treatment, or developing severe nicotine poisoning. By mid-century, the medical establishment had moved on to more conventional, though still questionable, methods, and the tobacco enema faded into obscurity, though not before countless drowning victims had been subjected to this most peculiar form of artificial respiration. Today, the idea seems laughable, but in its time, it was cutting-edge medicine, backed by the finest scientific minds of the age. So sleep now, and rest easy knowing that if you are ever pulled unconscious from the water, modern rescuers will reach for oxygen masks and defibrillators, not tobacco pipes and rectal tubes. Let your dreams be untroubled by visions of earnest physicians puffing away with grave determination, of red-faced rescuers blowing smoke with all their might, of an entire society convinced that the secret to life itself might just be hidden in a well-packed pipe and an unconventional delivery method. Imagine a time when the local apothecary's shelves groaned not with pills and potions, but with jars of squirming creatures, when a sore throat might be treated not with lozenges, but with the slow trail of snail slime, when whooping cough required not antibiotics, but the desperate swallowing of a live frog. This was the world of animal-based cures, where every creature, no matter how small or slimy, had its place in the dubious pantheon of folk medicine. The practice of swallowing live frogs for whooping cough was particularly widespread, found in rural communities from England to America. The treatment was simple, if horrifying to modern sensibilities. A child suffering from the characteristic whoop of pertussis would be given a small live frog, sometimes two, to swallow whole. The theory varied by region. Some believed the frog would absorb the illness as it died in the stomach. Others thought the creature's struggles would jolt the cough away, while some simply claimed the shock of the experience would scare the sickness right out of a person. Mothers would stand ready with spoons to push the frogs down reluctant throats, while physicians of the time nodded approvingly, noting how the treatment often coincided with the natural end of the illness's most severe phase, creating the illusion of effectiveness. The frogs weren't always swallowed. Some variations had the patient breathe into a frog's mouth, transferring the cough to the amphibian, which would then be released to hop away with the disease. Other versions used toads instead, considered more potent if less pleasant to swallow. Meanwhile, for sore throats, generations turned to a slower, stickier remedy, snail syrup. The preparation was as simple as it was revolting. Live garden snails would be collected, their shells cracked off, and the glistening bodies left to steep in sugar or honey for days, until their mucus dissolved into a thick, sweet syrup. This concoction would then be spooned into suffering patients, coating their throats with a film of mollusk slime. The French perfected this remedy, creating elaborate snail-based syrups with added herbs, while English country doctors preferred their snails roasted first, believing the charred mollusks held special healing properties. Snail mucus wasn't limited to throat treatments. It was rubbed on burns to soothe them, smeared on faces to prevent wrinkles, and even used as an early form of adhesive bandage, stretching over cuts to form a natural protective layer. The animal cures didn't stop there. Live spiders, rolled in butter, were swallowed for fevers. Earthworms soaked in wine treated jaundice, while mouse skins applied to warts were said to make them disappear. As the mouse decayed, so too would the wart. Hedgehog ashes mixed with honey cured baldness, provided one didn't mind smelling like burnt rodent. And for toothache, nothing worked better than a poultice of mashed dog's teeth, applied directly to the cheek. Some cures involved elaborate rituals, like catching a specific type of beetle at a certain moon phase, or using only black chickens for bloodletting. Others were deceptively simple, like wearing a live caterpillar around the neck in a bag to prevent goiters. The logic behind these treatments was rarely medical. often blending superstition with observation. If a frog could survive in water and on land, surely it could survive a cough in a child's belly. If snails left shiny trails, surely that shine could coat and protect a raw throat. These remedies persisted not because they worked, but because sometimes, through sheer coincidence, the patient got better. And so the frog swallowing continued. The snail syrup brewed anew each season. The spiders kept handy in jars, just in case. Today, we might shudder at these treatments, but they speak to a time when medicine was equal parts desperation and creativity, when every creature, no matter how small, might hold the secret to healing. So sleep now, and be grateful your cough syrup comes from pharmacies, not ponds, that your throat lozenges are mint flavored, not mollusk based, and that the only frogs you'll encounter tonight are those peaceful ones croaking lullabies outside your window, dreaming their own amphibious dreams, undisturbed by any thought of medicinal swallowing. Section 2. Cruel and unusual punishments. Imagine, if you can bear to imagine, a device so cruel, so carefully designed to inflict maximum suffering, that even in an age of brutal punishments, it stood out as particularly horrifying. This was the brazen bull, a terrible creation from ancient Greece, where the line between torture and art, between punishment and performance, became hopelessly blurred. Picture, if you will, a massive bull. Not a real bull, of course, but a bull-shaped container, made entirely of bronze, carefully molded by skilled metalworkers, hollow inside, just large enough to hold a full-grown person, with a small door on its side, a door that once closed would not open again until the gruesome spectacle was complete. The process was slow, terribly slow, and that was the point. First, the condemned person would be stripped naked, because humiliation was always part of the punishment. Then they would be forced inside the metal beast, their limbs folded awkwardly to fit the space. The heavy bronze door would shut with a final clang, sealing them in darkness. Outside, the executioners would light fires beneath the bull's belly, not a roaring blaze, but a steady, controlled heat, the kind that turns bronze from cool to warm to uncomfortably hot, to searing to unbearable, over the course of hours, not minutes. Inside, the prisoner would first notice the warmth, then the heat, then the pain as their skin began to blister. Their screams would start, loud at first, then louder still. But here's where the true horror of the brazen bull reveals itself. The bull was no simple oven. It was designed, with terrible cleverness, to transform those screams into something else entirely. The bull's head contained a series of tubes and pipes, carefully crafted by musicians and metal workers working together. These pipes would take the raw sound of human agony and filter it, shape it, until what emerged from the bull's nostrils wasn't a scream, but something resembling music, the shifting tones of a person dying in unbearable pain, converted into haunting, flute-like sounds. The inventor of this device, a man named Perilaus, reportedly presented his creation to the tyrant Valaris, boasting of how the bull's song would entertain royal guests, how the changing pitches would create melodies, how the smoke rising from the nostrils would carry the scent of burning flesh, like some perverse incense. Valaris, the story goes, was so impressed by this demonstration that he rewarded Perilaus by making him the bull's first victim. a dark irony that did nothing to prevent the bull's continued use. Over time, the brazen bull became more than just a method of execution. It became theater. The slow cooking process could take many hours, during which the music would change. As the victim's vocal cords burned, the screams would become weaker, the tones would shift from clear notes to gurgling moans to finally just the sound of fat sizzling on hot metal, all while crowds gathered to listen, to discuss whether the sounds resembled actual songs, whether this particular execution was more musical than the last. Some versions of the bull included small windows, so spectators could watch the human form twist and contort inside. Others had mechanisms to rotate the body, ensuring even cooking, like some nightmare version of a roasting spit. There were even accounts of prisoners being force-fed before execution, so that as their stomachs burst from the heat, the sound would add percussion to the terrible symphony. What makes the brazen bull especially horrifying isn't just the physical suffering it caused, but the way it turned that suffering into entertainment, the way it made pain into something to be appreciated, analyzed, even enjoyed. It represents one of the most disturbing examples of how punishment can become performance, how cruelty can be refined into art. The bull wasn't just about killing someone, it was about making their death a spectacle, a concert of suffering, with the victim as both performer and instrument. So sleep now, if you can, and be grateful that justice today, for all its flaws, doesn't include such carefully designed horrors. That punishment today aims to reform rather than to entertain, and that the only bulls in your dreams will be peaceful creatures of field and farm, not screaming, smoking, bronze monsters from humanity's darkest imaginings. Imagine, if you can bear to imagine, one of the slowest, most agonizing methods of execution ever devised by human cruelty, a punishment so drawn out, so meticulously terrible, that even in the brutal ancient world it stood out for its particular horror. This was Scaphism, the Persian boats, a method of killing that transformed the human body into a living feast for insects, a slow-motion nightmare of decay and consumption. The process began simply enough. The condemned prisoner would be stripped completely naked, then placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats, or sometimes between two halves of a single boat, bound together tightly with strong ropes, leaving only the head, hands, and feet protruding, the rest of the body trapped in that dark, enclosed space, unable to move, unable to escape what came next. The prisoner would be force-fed enormous quantities of milk and honey, far beyond what any person could comfortably consume, until they were sick with it, until their stomachs swelled painfully, and then, as if that weren't enough, more honey would be poured over their exposed limbs, their face, their genitals, every inch of skin coated in that sticky sweetness, attracting every insect within miles. Then, the real waiting began. The boats would be placed on a stagnant pond, or in a marshy area, where the water wouldn't move much, where the heat would build inside that wooden prison. Day after day after day, the milk and honey diet would give the prisoners severe diarrhea, their own waste accumulating in the boats, mixing with the honey, creating a foul soup of bodily fluids that the prisoner had to lie in, their skin softening, breaking down, in that acidic stew. Meanwhile, the honey coating their exposed parts would attract flies, wasps, ants, all manner of stinging, biting insects drawn to the sugar. The insects would begin with the exposed areas, the face, the hands, the feet, biting, stinging, laying eggs in the honey-coated flesh. But as days passed, as the prisoner's struggles weakened, as the wood absorbed moisture and began to warp slightly, insects would find their way inside the boats too, into that dark, warm, sweet-smelling space where most of the body lay. Maggots would hatch in the honey, in the wounds, burrowing into living flesh. Beetles would come to feed, drawn by the scent of decay that began long before death arrived. The prisoner's own body would begin working against them. The forced feeding continued daily, more milk, more honey, keeping them alive far beyond what should have been possible. The body's systems would start failing one by one, but consciousness would remain, awareness of what was happening, of the insects crawling, biting, breeding, the skin breaking down, the flesh becoming infested, the smell of their own body rotting while still alive. Days would pass, sometimes weeks, the boats becoming a floating coffin of suffering, the prisoners' screams growing weaker, the insects growing more numerous, the honey attracting ever more creatures to the feast. Some accounts describe how the boats would gradually sink lower in the water, as the body inside literally fell apart, limbs becoming detached, organs liquefying, the wooden vessels filling with soup of decomposition, while the prisoner still breathed, still felt, still understood what was happening to them. The end, when it finally came, was usually from infection, or septic shock, or simply the body giving up after unimaginable suffering. But what made Scafism particularly horrifying wasn't just the physical pain, it was the psychological torment, the complete helplessness, the knowledge that this slow unraveling of one's own body would continue, and continue, with no hope of relief, no possibility of rescue, just the endless progression of decay, the unstoppable consumption by creatures that didn't care whether their meal was still screaming, still begging, still praying for death. So sleep now, if you can, and be grateful that such nightmares exist only in history books, that justice today, however imperfect, doesn't include such calculated, slow-motion cruelty, and that the only boat in your dreams will carry you peacefully across calm waters, not trap you in an endless waking nightmare of honey and decay. Imagine, if you can, a device so simple in its design, yet so devastating in its effect, that just the sight of it could make the strongest person confess to anything. This was the rack, Tudor England's favorite tool for extracting information, for punishing criminals, for stretching the human body beyond its natural limits, until bones popped from their sockets, until muscles tore like overstrained ropes, until the victim's body became a living map of pain. The rack was essentially a wooden frame, usually mounted on a raised platform, with rollers at both ends. The prisoner would be laid flat on their back, their wrists tied to one roller, their ankles to the other. Then, with the slow turn of a handle, the rollers would begin to rotate in opposite directions, stretching the body with relentless, mechanical precision, inch by excruciating inch. The first sensations, according to torture manuals of the time, were merely uncomfortable, a tight pulling at the joints, a strange pressure in the limbs. But as the turning continued, as the body was stretched further than nature ever intended, the real pain would begin. Tendons would scream in protest, ligaments would strain to their breaking point, The spine would elongate unnaturally, vertebrae separating beyond what the body could endure. Torture manuals from the period describe the process in dry, technical terms, noting exactly how many turns of the handle were needed for certain effects. A quarter turn might produce discomfort. Half a turn would begin causing real pain. One full turn would start dislocating joints. 2 turns would risk permanent damage. The manuals might as well have been recipes for baking bread, so matter-of-fact were their instructions for breaking human bodies. The beauty of the rack, from the torturer's perspective, was its adjustability. The pain could be precisely controlled, increased by tiny increments, paused at will. The victim could be stretched just to the edge of dislocation, then left hanging there for hours, days even, in that terrible limbo between agony and relief. The sounds were reportedly the worst part. The quiet creaking of the mechanism, the occasional groan of the wooden frame. Then, when the stretching reached critical points, the sudden pops and cracks as shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, all gave way in turn. The wet, tearing sounds of muscles separating, the sharp cries that even the bravest prisoners couldn't suppress. Tudor torturers were trained to recognize the different sounds, to know exactly what damage was being done by the particular crunch or snap they heard. Some versions of the rack included additional features to intensify the suffering: spikes on the bed that pressed into the back, weights that could be hung from the stretched limbs, heated metal plates placed beneath the victim, all while the relentless stretching continued, turning the body into something barely recognizable as human. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical. Prisoners would often be shown the rack first, allowed to examine its workings, to see the stains from previous victims, to imagine what those slow turns of the handle would feel like. Many confessed immediately, without ever being strapped to the device. Such was its fearsome reputation. Those who endured the rack faced permanent consequences even if they survived. Dislocated joints that would never properly heal, muscles that would never regain their strength, a spine that would never again support the body without pain. Some victims were left permanently taller, their skeletons stretched beyond natural limits, a living reminder of their ordeal in their very bones. The rack wasn't just a tool for punishment. It was a statement, a demonstration of power, proof that the state could reach inside a person's body and rearrange it at will. That pain could be measured out in precise, scientific doses. That human resilience had limits, and the government knew exactly how to find them. So sleep now, if you can, and be grateful that such devices exist only in museums now. That justice today, however flawed, doesn't include such calculated dismantling of the human body, and that the only stretching in your dreams will be the comfortable kind, of muscles loosening, of limbs relaxing, not the terrible, mechanical stretching of bones separating under relentless pressure. Imagine, if you can, a darkness so complete, a fear so primal, that even the bravest souls would beg for mercy. This was rat torture, a method so simple, so horrifying, that it required no special tools, just a cage, a few hungry rats, and the cruel imagination of those who believed pain could reveal truth. The process began with the victim being strapped down, completely immobile, usually on their back, their bare stomach exposed to the cold air. Then, The torturers would take a metal cage, just large enough to hold several live rats, and place it upside down on the prisoner's soft belly, the cold metal pressing into vulnerable flesh, sometimes heated first, to make the rats more frantic, more desperate to escape. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the torturers would apply heat to the top of the cage, perhaps with coals, or a torch, or simply hot stones. As the metal grew warmer, the rats would panic, their claws scrabbling against the victim's skin, their high-pitched squeaks filling the air. Then, as the heat became unbearable, the rats would do what all trapped creatures do. They would try to escape, and the only way out, the only soft spot in their metal prison, would be downward, through the human flesh beneath them. The sounds came first, the scratching, the squeaking, the victim's rapid breathing turning to whimpers, then screams, then, if the torture continued, the wetter sounds, the terrible noises of small teeth and claws breaking through skin, finding purchase in soft tissue, burrowing deeper, seeking safety in the warmth of human insides. Some torturers would lift the cage periodically, letting the victims see the progress, the blood, the torn flesh, the rats now half buried in living tissue, then replace it to continue the gruesome process. Others preferred to keep the cage sealed until the rats had completely disappeared inside, leaving only bloody tunnels behind. The psychological terror was as calculated as the physical pain. Prisoners could hear the rats moving inside them, feel the tiny feet pressing against their organs, the unnatural wriggling of creatures nesting where no living thing should be. Some victims went mad before dying. Others survived with horrific injuries, hollowed out sections of torso that would never properly heal. Always remembering, always feeling phantom rodents moving beneath their skin. Now, let your mind drift from the dry horror of rat torture to the watery terror of ducking stools. Imagine a wooden chair, mounted on a long pole, suspended over a pond or river, the accused witch strapped firmly into the seat, her skirts tied between her legs to prevent indecency. Because even in torture, appearances mattered. The test was simple in its cruelty. If she floated, she was guilty, the water rejecting her evil. If she sank, she was innocent, though likely drowned. The stool would be lowered slowly, the first cold shock of water around her ankles, then her knees, her waist, each dunking lasting longer than the last, the crowd counting the seconds, watching for signs of struggle, the water closing over her head, bubbles rising. Then, just when it seemed too late, she would be hauled up, gasping, choking, only to be plunged under again, and again, and again. The sounds were rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The creak of the wooden mechanism, the splash of immersion, the gurgle of bubbles, the gasping breaths between dunks, the crowd's murmurs growing bored as the spectacle continued, hour after hour, until either the woman confessed, or her body went limp in the straps, or the torturers grew tired of their sport. Some stools were designed to roll into the water, creating a more dramatic spectacle. Others had weights to ensure proper sinking. All shared the same terrible purpose, to make a game of suffering, to turn justice into something that looked like entertainment, but smelled like fear and pond water. So, as you float on the edge of sleep, consider this. Maybe modern medicine isn't so bad. Maybe our justice system, for all its flaws, is better than cages and rats. Maybe our treatments, however imperfect, beat drinking ground-up mummies or swallowing live frogs. Let this thought comfort you as you drift away. The horrors of the past fading like echoes in a dark corridor. Good night, sleep well, and whatever you do, don't drink mummy powder. Don't swallow frogs for coughs. Don't let anyone convince you that radium is good for your teeth. Just close your eyes, breathe deep, and rest. Safe in the knowledge that the worst thing you'll face tomorrow is probably just Monday. Not rats, not ducking stools, not any of history's countless cruelties. Just Monday. And you can handle Monday. Sleep now.